I'm a watch YouTuber. I'm not the only one. I and all other YouTubers say a lot of things about watches. Some things are smart, and some things are potentially very stupid. Today I'm going to tackle some of them and test how dumb or smart the things we say, including myself, actually are. Let's dive in. Britt Pierce and a whole lot more harp about two things on the Omega Speedmaster: the bracelet and the helium escape valve. Both have the challenge of potentially being to the detriment of the subjective aesthetics of the watch. That was an overly complicated way of saying that the helium valve and that bracelet are potentially ugly to a lot of people. An oyster-style bracelet and no helium escape valve will likely make this watch more, and this is the faintest of praise, broadly appealing. I agree on the bracelet. That bracelet is just no longer with the times and needs to be updated. It needs more taper and it needs to be different. But the valve, it has to stay. It is what sets this watch apart. We have enough basic divers. This is the key, the differentiator, the quirky little detail that makes this watch endearing to its owners. They could make it a little bit smaller, but it needs to stay. What they could do, though, is make a move towards a smaller case, maybe a less pronounced bezel, and something all Omegas need at the moment, a thinner case. John Mayer and Ed Sheeran said Hublot is a good watch. Because they did the last talking watches, they count as watch YouTubers. In their last video, Ed Sheeran and John Mayer were talking about one of Ed's Hublots, and they agreed it's a good watch. They're wrong. 1. I like the designs of Hublot. I actually am a big fan of some of their ceramic models. Personally, I think many of them are more interesting than some of the Richard Milles, and if I had a bucket load of money, I would honestly, absolutely honestly, consider buying one. But the base Hublot, it costs $8,000. It has a Salita movement. Hodinkee themselves once reviewed the watch, or was it Fratello, and they stated the movement had an industrial finishing. That's journalistic speak for they did nothing to it. Will it keep time? Yes. Could it last just as long as a Rolex or AP? Very likely, yes. But there's a difference between having a net worth of $100 million and being a normal person where a watch purchase is a measured, considered decision. If you have $100 million, whether it's a quartz movement or a Salita or a Lange & Söhne, money does not enter into the equation. A $1,000 Salita watch or an $8,000 Salita watch makes absolutely no impact on your income. Value for money is just not as important. I've said it in a different video. If they like a watch, they like a watch. If you like a watch, you like a watch. But price does not mean anything to these people, which, by the way, was abundantly clear in that video. They're nice guys, but they have no clue what money is. But for normal people, I would never suggest buying an $8,000 watch that has the same movement as a Christopher Ward. And the Ward is COSC certified and just as well finished. Having said that, overall, I like Hublot. Adrian Barker says, if you think it's too expensive, don't buy it. Adrian said this in a video on About Effing Time. It was about this almost constant complaining about watch prices, both in the public but also in the media. His conclusion was just don't buy it then. There's a lot to unpack there, but I honestly don't agree. Now, is it a bit tiring to only hear about how JLC has become too expensive? Yes. That TAG has increased their prices too much? Yes, of course it is. I've done it myself, and often when I'm reviewing a watch, I'll touch on the way I perceive the value of the price. But I think if you're a YouTuber, you need to share your thinking on the value of a watch. The value for money compared to other offerings. It's part of the purchasing decision, so I feel we are more or less obliged to touch on it. The rest, now complaining about pricing is necessary. Believe you me, this information does feed back to the brands. Brands do pay attention to how their prices are perceived. Maybe not Richard Mille, but even Rolex does pay attention. As a vocal group, it has a value that we do not just align with industry insiders and just assume that high prices are a fact of life. Pretty much all Swiss brands are making bank like there's no tomorrow at the moment. So voicing your distaste with your perception of their pricing is perfectly fair and reasonable, and perfectly reasonable consumer behavior. Shutting up about something you think is not good enough is not the solution. Tudor and Rolex are boring. Theo and Harris. Christian and Michael have said this on many occasions. Adrian Barker is known as Captain Boring because he barely owns anything but Rolex. Are these brands boring? Yes. Yes, they are. Of course, it depends on how you define boring. I own two Tudors at the moment. I have the FXD Alinghi and the Tudor GMT. I like both brands. Their watches, to me, look amazing. But Tudor and Rolex aim for the middle of the road. Over 1/3 of all Swiss watches in terms of revenue come from Rolex. The only way you get to be that big is by being broadly appealing to as many people as possible. That, by definition, means playing it safe. The broad market, the mass market, that which most people like, is the most simply appealing, the safest. That, in some people's eyes, is boring. This is also why Rolex is a statement piece and a nothing piece at the same time. If you go to any Reddit forum, and people will tell you, nobody cares that you wear a Rolex. On the other hand, you'll find just as many articles that a Rolex is a statement piece. Why the contradiction? Because 30% of the market. That's why. It's not a statement piece if everybody and your sister owns one. It becomes, by definition, the safe choice, and thereby the boring choice. Rolex is gunning for Patek and the Holy Trinity. No, just no. You hear this every now and again, somebody saying how Rolex is moving upmarket, but it's simply not correct. Rolex sells over 1 million watches a year. Patek, less than 70,000. That's 7% of what Rolex does. I'm just going to compare Patek for simplicity. Rolex is an expert at mass producing excellent quality luxury watches. Patek is an expert at producing very small batches of primarily individually built and finished watches. Rolex cannot do what Patek does at that scale. And Rolex has no goal of reducing their volume. Quite the opposite. They're building a factory to get to 2 million. 2. Most of Patek's watches you get interviewed for. They are highly coveted and you need to build a long relationship to get a hold of. Rolex, you just need to spend money at the same AD. You can buy Tudor, Omega, whatever. If the AD is making money, you will eventually get most of the Rolexes you want. Patek, to get what you want, you need to start with buying some of the display models of Patek. It takes time. It takes way more money. And it's the difference between being a desirable Rolex with a limited availability and an unobtainable watch with availability for only the select few. 3. Patek hand finishes their movements. Rolex has just put a display case back on a movement. There's no contest. Rolex competes with the Trinity for rich people's attention, but Rolex can never and will never get to that level. G-Shock is God tier. Casio G-Shocks are solid watches that are reasonably priced and completely unpretentious. That's what they are. There's no hand-finished mumbo-jumbo. There's no talk about in-house movements. G-Shocks are more or less never sold out or unattainable. That's what's so unique about them. They don't have the baggage of quartz movements in what should be a mechanical watch or luxury pricing or whatever, and everybody can get one. So the in-crowd or the rich cannot limit access to the brand. In a world where there is so much pretense and status attached to watches, and even a moon swatch becomes a status symbol, Casio and G-Shock have succeeded in just making cool, attainable watches. No other watch brand succeeds at that. So yeah, no one above or to the side. That might as well be God tier. The code 1159 is just there to act as an entry to the Royal Oak. No. The code 1159 is there to secure that the AP has more than just the Royal Oak to hang their hat on. AP know that they can't only rely on the Royal Oak. The first code 1159 was not good. The second iteration of them is actually really getting there, and although they're not my kind of thing, what I do think they are is an interesting offering. I would definitely suggest you at least take a look if you have that kind of money. They do have a lot more appeal than they get credit for. It needs an easy adjust bracelet. I've been hearing this in a lot of videos. People look at a watch, it has a steel bracelet like the Hamilton Khaki Expedition, and then the comment comes, it lacks an easy adjust bracelet. I have 3 angles to this. Integrated bracelet sports watches that have a seamless connection between the one end of the bracelet or the other, like the Cartier Santos or the CW12. They can't have an easy adjust system. It's not technically possible when you want this seamless aesthetic. Where would the adjustable piece go? I've heard YouTubers say this and it frustrates me because it's a question of form over function. To make that bracelet look good, you can't have an easy adjustment. And I think the comment just throwing it out there in that context is misplaced. Easy adjustment isn't always necessary. For most people, you can size a watch right from day one, and even between summer and winter, their wrists do not swell or shrink in a way that markedly changes the wearing experience. It's just not necessary for all people, and a simple spring bar solution will for many people work fine. and you'll save some money. But technology is so far along that it is a feature that should be in any bracelet on a watch at $2,500 and above. Above there, it just needs to be standard. On a certain price of car, I want soft closed doors. Cruise control and distance control in a car also needs to be standard, not as an option. Easy adjust is becoming such a common technology that it just needs to be there. End of story. This is the general consensus on watch sizing. 37 to 40 millimeters is the right size apparently. 47 millimeter lug to lug is the right lug to lug. Lug width should be 20 or 22 millimeters, and any height over 13.5 millimeters is too much. If you watch enough YouTube videos, you will know that most YouTubers will gravitate towards those numbers. I, like all other YouTubers, often feel obliged to reference these numbers because they are, together with the movement specs, the only sort of objective data points for these watches. So we recite them and give our take on whether or not that makes for a good watch. It's kind of a rock and a hard place thing for YouTubers and also other publications because omitting the numbers will also likely be frowned upon. But there are a couple of problems. The Tudor Alinghi Chrono has a lug-to-lug of about 50 millimeters. This is for most people quite huge, but because the fixed lugs are at the extreme ends of the lugs and sit below the case back, it wears much smaller than a 48 millimeter lug-to-lug Speedy. The Tudor Black Bay GMT is a slab-sided watch with a height of 14.7 millimeters, but because the overall case is quite large, the height is not going to be a problem for you if you have the wrist circumference for the lug-to-lug. Everybody typically complains about the long lug-to-lugs and lugs of Nomuses, but overall with slim bracelets, these watches wear smaller than you would expect. It boils down to proportions. There are watches like the Grand Seiko Tentograph that I think to most is objectively too thick. There are watches with modular giant movements that demand a huge case, but more often than not, the overall proportions, so the ratio between height and width and lug to lug is more important than the individual number. And finally, it's 100% dependent on what you find to be appealing on your own wrist. And often the combination of factors is more important than the one number in itself. And we joke about how big watches were in the early 2000s. Giant Panerai's and Breitlings, but we wore them and we thought they looked good. Now, apparently watches have to be smaller, and we make jokes about those big watches. We, as a species, have not lost weight since the early 2000s. How can something that was perfectly sized for us 20 years ago now seem too big? Well, because it's subjective. Aesthetic fit is not an objective truth. Sure, Christian from Theo and Harris is a skinny-wristed guy, so sure, he's going to prefer something that's a little bit more restrained size-wise, but that's the point. You have to put it on your own wrist. That's the only way you'll know. So us YouTubers will continue to recite the numbers, and You're Terrific will joke about the size of his wrist, and you will have to go down to the store and put it on and make up your own mind. That's what I had for this time around. What silly or unusual thing do you hear YouTubers say? Are there things that are silly that I say? Let me know in the comments. I'm curious to hear it. Like, subscribe. Cheers.